In this tutorial, I'm going to give you a quick rundown on what RAW files are and how you can edit them in Photoshop's Camera Raw plugin. When you have your nice fancy schmancy digital camera and you're going to go set the setting for how large you want the resolution to be, you may have an option that says RAW. And if you haven't run into that before, RAW is a completely uncompressed file that has not had any adjustments made to it. It is the purely raw data from your photo. Anytime you choose one of the JPEG options, the moment you click that, your camera automatically compresses the image and probably does things to it like contrast and vibrance and lightening and some just photo adjustment things before you even unload it onto your computer. A RAW file is completely uncompressed, so they're usually quite large, and also the main difference between a JPEG and a RAW is a JPEG has 256 levels of gray. That's as much data as it can hold, or the range of data. A RAW file has somewhere in the neck of the woods of about 1400 levels, and it has so much more data in it, so it can withstand a lot more editing before it starts doing that kind of noise or dirty grungy look. So I have just a couple files to give you a quick example of. So I was out shooting in, oh sorry, I should show you how to open these. So in a RAW file might have a different extension depending on who the maker of your camera is. I have a Nikon and a Canon. The Nikon is a .NEF, the Canon is a .CR2. And when you want to open these, you can just double click on it like you would any other Photoshop file, and it should open right up. So I'm going to open those two. So I'm going to show you how you can take a photo, and this is the original RAW photo, and edit it within Camera Raw to something that looks, I admit, a little over the top and postcardy. And I'm ashamed a bit to admit to you that I'm an extremely lazy photographer, and I do lean quite a bit on my Photoshop abilities. So let's start with this image, and it is quite big. Just by the way, I think the camera I use is a 24 megapixel, but here's Camera Raw. If you have multiple images open, you'll see them over here on the side. You can affect one at a time or both by holding down Shift and clicking, but I would recommend just working with one at a time unless you've got a whole slew of things that you need to make the same adjustment to. Then up on the top you've got some basic editing controls, such as a control to level your horizon if that was a problem. You can also crop it at any point. The crop on this is not going to be permanent. Anything you do to this file is actually going to get saved off as a little extra file, and your original will just remain. So think of RAW as really truly the negative of the digital world. Once you have it cropped for composition's sake, then go into editing, and your editing options are over here on the right. If I begin with basic, you can do simple things such as exposure, lightening or darkening, or even targeting problem areas like specifically the shadows or the whites. You can also affect the contrast in this area, or affect what is called clarity, which is a little bit different. It's sort of a bunch of adjustments wrapped into one, and is especially nice on portraits, which I'll get to in just a minute, but clarity will kind of sharpen detail up. You can also bump up the vibrance, which pretty much is a given in photos. It seems like it's impossible for an actual camera to catch the true vibrance of color that the eye can see, so cranking that up is a little bit nice. It's a little less aggressive than a saturation adjustment. You can also affect the overall temperature. If the picture's feeling a little on the cool side, you could bump it over to the yellow, which is warm, or vice versa down here on the bottom. As for white balance, if it was taken under one of these options, you can do a white balance, but I'm going to leave it where it's at, and then move on to the really cool part. And I was so excited to learn about these. You'll notice, of course, that the sky is way overexposed, with hardly any color in the sky and little in the mountain. In a typical photo, that would just mean that that color is not there. I could go back and maybe paint it in Photoshop, but frequently in a raw image, the detail is there, we just have to reveal it. This gradient option, if I click on that, it will allow me to make a lot of the adjustments that I just did, but only to a specific area of the photo. So I'm going to come here on my right and just zero out these so when I apply this it won't show up anywhere. And then create the gradient. Apparently I need to set one of the adjustments just so it'll be there. So I'm going to click and hold shift so it's just straight and drag right down, which will apply a gradient here, you'll see in a moment. I need to take the exposure level down on this top portion of the image. So if I grab that and bring it down, oh, there it is. We knew that had there in there somewhere. And I can affect just this area. And it's applying the effect in a gradient, meaning it's 100% here at the green and 0% at the red, and fades out in between the two. To get rid of that annoying little dotted line, all I have to do is come back over here on the top to one of these other editing options, and I should see my regular editing controls. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this so we can see a bit closer. The details could use a little bit of sharpening. If I zoom in really close, you'll notice that I have the classic problem of lightening up your dark areas with noise appearing. Noise is kind of that gritty, sandy look that'll show up in areas that were too dark originally. Now in a raw file you'll be able to get a lot more image back from those dark areas than you would in another, but it still might have some noise. So under sharpening you can not only sharpen your details, but you should also be able to play with the noise reduction, and you probably can't see it on your screen, but if you were playing with the same thing you'd be able to see that it softens out some of that noise without getting rid of the crisp edges of detail. Once you've played with that a little bit, it's also fun to move on to the hue, saturation, and luminance area. So hue, you can very specifically affect the color in here. For example, if I wanted to offset my blue sky with something a little different, just grabbing my blue slider will take all of the blues, leave everything else alone, and move them over to purple. Now I don't really want to change the hue of anything, but I do want to make the red of these mountains pop just a little more. So I'm going to come into saturation and just bump up my red and my orange just a little bit. Luminance is also another area that can really make colors pop without making it come too over the top. And so now you can see I'm getting kind of close to where I was with this other photo. It's a little bit different, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on this area, but you can see that was a huge difference just in a very short period of time. Now the other and last lovely couple of things I'll show you here is you have an option under effects to apply a vignette, which is a natural, something that naturally happens from a camera lens that you can fake a little bit more, and it brings focus into the center. So I really like using vignettes as an effect. Grain, if you actually wanted grain in your image, you could add that. And then lastly, back in the hue, saturation, and luminance, you can convert the whole thing to grayscale and still affect the dark or brightness of an area by the color that it actually is. So those orange mountains in the background, you can see where those are changing, and green areas. So photos that are fairly monochromatic would not be a good one to do with this feature, but if you have something, for example, I was taking photos of a friend and she was wearing a dark blue dress against a red background, I could very easily affect the blue of her dress through this feature. Once you've got all your adjustments done, you probably will still want to open it up in Photoshop and finish your adjustments. So at that point you say open image and it will open it in Photoshop. Now, this is a copy. This is no longer the actual RAW file. In fact, when I save it, it will ask me to change it to either a Photoshop file or a JPEG. So I usually leave it the same number as the original file and just put ADJ at the end of mine, which means for me that it's been adjusted. If you don't want it to be compressed, you want to print perfectly uncompressed, maybe change it to a TIFF and make sure your layers are turned off and click Save. So that's a basic landscape adjustment. Back over here in our window browser, I acquired a new file, and it's this one right here. This is a .xmp, and this is what Camera Raw created. These are all of the edits I made to that photo. So if I click on my raw photo and then hit spacebar, it actually still looks the same as when we originally saw it. But if I opened it up in Camera Raw would read this .xmp file and apply those changes. So if you ever want to go back to the original file to just start from scratch in Camera Raw, just come into your Finder and delete the .xmp file. When you move files around though, make sure you keep those two together or you'll have to do your edits all over again.